Welcome to the Middlesex Moments radio show. I am Dr. Anna Wasesha, president of Middlesex Community College, and joining me today is Ben Boutaugh. Ben teaches in our business program here at the college, and he's been a guest on the program before. He's not only got an MBA, teaches in areas of tax and finance, but he's also got himself a JD, a Juris Doctor, and so he's practiced as a lawyer, and he's a Middletown native. So I think you've had a chance, if you've been listening, to get to know him a little better. And at the last time we met, I asked him if he'd come back so we could go a little further into fiscal policy and monetary policy. Now, I recognize it's the noon hour, and we got lots of other things on our mind, and these things are sometimes complex, but just for the sake of discussion, and because we're in the silly season of the presidential election and we're listening to the candidates left and right talk about fiscal policy, I wanted to ask Ben if he would come and talk with us today about what it is. Let's just start at the basics.
Good morning. Fiscal policy deals basically with the budget. It's a revenue stream of income via taxes, as well as expenditures, which are the programs that the government offers service constituents, the citizens. When there's a shortfall in revenue, taxes relative to expenditures, the government has to borrow money, and that's where this whole debt issue arises. When there's not enough money to satisfy our expenditures, the government has to borrow money in the form of either selling bonds or actually borrowing money in the form of the loan to deal with the shortfall. Now, I'd like to compare that to monetary policy, which is what the Federal Reserve is in charge of. And that's really controlling the money supply through interest rates, and there's other ways you can do that to either control the economy to help it grow or to control it so you don't have issues of inflation.
And so obviously we pay a lot of attention to the Fed right now because we say, well, we hope that they'll be able to help us.
Correct.
Keep us at least in stasis.
Correct.
But to go back to fiscal policy, so it emanates from basically the Congress? Who's in charge of our fiscal policy?
Well, it's kind of Congress as well as the executive branch, with Obama being the president, and this exists at the state level with the General Assembly and Dan Malloy's office being the governor. Legislative body, either be a Congress or General Assembly, ultimately has to approve whatever budget we have. The executive branch typically puts forward a proposed budget, but then obviously that can get either cut or certain things can be eliminated or passed depending on what the legislative body ultimately decides. So it's a give and take of checks and balances between the executive branch and the legislative branch of government.
And of course it's heavily influenced by lobbyists.
Correct.
Yes,
correct.
Right. Well, we have to take a break now, and when we come back, I'm going to talk a little bit about those heavily influencing groups, and including the one that's in the news quite a lot right now, which is the Occupy Wall Street group. Well, welcome back. With me today is Ben Boutaugh, who's an instructor, professor here at Middlesex Community College, and we're talking about this enormous issue that falls under the heading fiscal policy. But let's take some specific examples. I would just say, in my mind, in the context of the demonstrations that we're seeing all across the country now, the Occupy Hartford, Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Washington, D.C. This is a spreading demonstration of many, many Americans' frustration with fiscal policy and what it means for us individually as job holders and citizens and family members. So, Ben, what have you got on your docket today?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment most recently, as of last week, President Obama's initiative to stimulate job growth or sustain job growth and actually implemented, or at least try to pass forward to Congress, a significant job plan. Fortunately, it's the way I think it's going to be addressed is they're going to take bits and pieces of it. And most recently, a provision required to earmark $35 billion to the states and local governments to prevent layoffs of teachers, police officers, and firefighters. And the rationale for this, at least amongst the Democrats, is to save or create approximately 400,000 jobs. But the million-dollar question is how do you fund this initiative? Democrats would like to use a 0.5% surtax on income in excess of $1 million.
This gets to the Wall Street 99% piece,
right? Obviously, the GOP, the Republicans, have an issue with this because they feel that it's a permanent tax on approximately 300,000 business owners because they would be bearing the burden of funding this program. And that's where they stand at the moment. Initially, they're objecting to it, but it sounds like there's a lot of give and take. I don't know if that law will actually pass, or at least the proposal will pass in its existing form. It may pass if they try to weed out certain provisions, but at least that's what's being offered by Obama at the moment.
Is this a tax on individuals earning over $1 million or a tax on corporations?
It's my understanding is income on individuals earning in excess of $1 million.
Right. So
Now, if you get into the tax code, I mean, we could deal with how corporations are taxed and so forth, and there's a lot of debate and commentary on this. Really, it comes down to should they reform this tax code, which I'm not sure if most of you know is approximately 71,000 pages. So there are some problems, arguably, with the tax code. A lot has to do with the tax breaks. One, it's burdensome and it's onerous, but a lot of criticism comes to the amount of money we're not collecting. Some commentators have argued it's a very inefficient way. It's not a very efficient process to begin with. We supposedly have the highest corporate tax rate of 35%, one of the highest. Only Japan has one higher at 39.5%. We only average collecting taxes somewhere around 25%. And I can give you a couple stats. For instance, last year on 2010 income, GE paid no taxes.
Right.
I do have some stats on.
And that's because they're able to take some of their losses and write it up against their,
Well,
right? The balance.
It's not even the losses, it's the tax credits, the tax shelters, and the subsidies. And the way the tax code works, it actually encourages companies to keep profits overseas, and it becomes a non-taxable event for them. Not surprisingly, GE has one of the largest tax departments made up of former IRS agents, as well as the former treasurer, former official from the Treasury, John Samuels, who worked on tax writing committees that actually worked for GE to come up with ways to avoid paying taxes.
Right.
In principle, they have a structure set up to try to capture taxes to help the revenue stream. In practice, it doesn't really happen because of all the loopholes. Now, there's a number of politicians who comment that they'd like to change this scenario. However, they have political pressures that don't allow them to do that. Do as I say, not as I do type of situation. And for instance, Senator Mitchell McConnell, who's a Republican who's from Kentucky, has commented that he would like to overhaul the IRS tax code with the loopholes and tax breaks that exist. However, in 2008, he secured a tax break for owners of thoroughbred racehorses to allow them to take certain write-offs. And again, his rationale was to protect jobs in Kentucky.
Sure.
Senator John Kerry, supporter of proposals to try to get rid of these tax breaks, supports tax cuts for small breweries. Behind this is one of his constituents is Samuel Adams Brewery out of Boston.
Sure.
So while politicians really would like to change the tax code, they have political pressures would actually force them to enable it to exist. So there's definitely a conflict.
Right. And and to some degree, that makes me think about incentives, right? I mean, so
Correct.
think about microbreweries. You might want to promote small business, local, businesses. So you say, well, we need a tax incentive, right, to do that. So if you take essentially an incentive can be a loophole.
Correct.
Right.
And it's funny how the Republicans view the tax breaks because they perceive them more as an incentive and actually allowing businesses to be more competitive with their global competition, while the Democrats perceive it more of just a way of tax avoidance, which affects our ability to balance the budget.
Right. So how do you take 71,000 pages and turn it into anything rational?
Well, I don't think anybody has a really good answer, but most recently Herman Cain, the most popular Republican candidate right now for the presidential nomination, has formulated this tax reform plan called 999. And after doing a little research, I've been led to believe this is only a portion of a bigger plan. There's apparently 3 phases to this plan. And just let me check my notes here. The first phase actually looks to reduce and eliminate business taxes to a maximum of 25%. But some of the criticisms, at least on the initial plan that he's put forth, doesn't make any mention of those folks paying at the 10%, 15%, or 25% tax brackets. It really only focuses on those in the higher echelon. He also comments, or at least this is from Bruce Bartlett from the New York Times, the tax breaks at the initial phase will only benefit corporations because it doesn't really affect any of the other business forms, sole proprietorships, S corporations or LLCs, because mostly the owners are taxed as individuals, not as corporations.
Oh, right.
So then there's also phase 2 where the plan would eliminate payroll tax, estate tax, and gift tax. And again, that really is going to benefit whom? Payroll tax will benefit the corporation, but the estate and gift tax are typically going to benefit the wealthy who have the money to either plan to make sure their money at the time of passing is going to somebody tax-free, or during their lifetime they can gift to avoid certain tax consequences. And it's estimated that the government would lose approximately $800 billion in revenue if that was implemented. And then part of the second phase would be 999, which is a flat 9% individual income tax across the board. It's not progressive. A 9% corporate tax rate, and a 9% national sales tax, which at least supply side, conservatives call this a fair tax. That's the terminology they use. And surprisingly, I learned that Mr. Cain relied upon a financial investor to come up with this plan. It's not through economists who have worked in certain administrations. Apparently the gentleman works for some Wells Fargo as a financial investor, and he's the one behind this initiative that Mr. Cain's pushing forth at the moment.
And it's got this, the 999 is certainly an easy thing to remember. Mm-hmm. It's got a ring to it. Mm-hmm. But I was preparing myself a little bit for this interview, and I was reading that, and I find this hard to believe, but I was reading that 47% of Americans who pay taxes, who are eligible to pay taxes, actually don't pay taxes because their incomes are so low that they don't pass the threshold where they would owe the government any money. Right.
And surprisingly, I saw the same statistic, and this would now force those folks to pay taxes.
Right.
So, and then you add on top of that a national sales tax, which would tax food, milk, everyday staples. It really becomes a regressive tax.
Right.
And some of the other comments or criticisms, it basically relies or assumes that more money is going to be in the hands of the wealthy, and then they will spend that money to stimulate the economy. And at least some commentators have said George W. Bush's initiatives tried to do the same thing during his administration, and they've found no evidence that it did stimulate the economy.
In fact, it is a little bitter pill to swallow that during the Clinton administration we were running a surplus, and the fiscal policies from the administration that succeeded the Clinton administration, one might say, have led us to the position we're in right now. Of course, it's very complicated, but it is something to ponder. In fact, I heard this radio program where it turned out that the Clinton administration commissioned a white paper on how the United States would operate in the year 2012 when they predicted, this is back in 2000, they predicted we would have no national debt. And weirdly, the consequence of that would be we would have no bonds to sell. And a huge part of the world market and an enormous part of the national market depends on being able to buy the bonds that the U.S. government issues in order to address debt. So it would throw everything into tilt again. And now we need to take another break. We're going to come back and talk some more with Ben Boutaugh about economics in the United States, national policy, fiscal policy. Hey, welcome back to Middlesex Moments Radio Show. I'm Dr. Anna Wasesha, the president of Middlesex Community College, and I've been talking with Ben Boutaugh, a professor here in our business department. And we've taken on an enormous issue this morning, which is fiscal policy and taxes. And we've been discussing some of the conversation that's happening at a national level now as part of the presidential campaign. Recently, one of the things that's gotten the most attention is Herman Cain's proposal that we go to a 999 tax situation. I think we've already talked a little bit about what that means, but there are some historical precedents for this kind of flat tax or simplified tax code, right, Ben?
I believe it was Stephen Forbes who ran for the presidency, I want to say back in the 90s, had promoted this type of flat tax scenario just to simplify and eliminate the current existing tax code. And it's my understanding, actually, Herman Cain worked for Mr. Forbes during that run for presidency. And, I don't know if you're aware of this, Anna, Herman's actually was a CEO for Godfather Pizza, and apparently he also was a lobbyist after he left that position, and he worked as a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. for a restaurant association. It was the National Restaurant Association, where he actually tried to promote certain agendas to represent that particular party before the legislative body in Washington, D.C. And I think that just the comment is he presents himself as being an outsider, but if you're a lobbyist, he must have some intimate knowledge on how Washington works and who the players are, and et cetera.
Sure. We're talking about economics and tax code and how complicated that is, but certainly the presidency and the campaigns for presidency in our country are also extraordinarily complex.
Right.
Underwritten by tremendous sums of money, lots of interest
Right.
coming into the arena to try to make sure
Right.
that their candidate makes it to the front. But, I want to just go back to the idea that the taxes leading to, historically, the old Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party, no taxation without representation. In this new age, the Tea Party group is again sort of an anti-tax movement in our country. And then I spring immediately to the Occupy Wall Street group, because there is an undercurrent, and now maybe an overcurrent, of real concern that the politicians in Washington, those people who are creating our fiscal policy, are not speaking to the day-to-day life experiences of the majority of Americans. 47% of Americans actually who could be paying taxes do not need to, because they're living below a level where their income would be taxed.
Right. Just from my understanding, I think this group represents a certain portion of our population that just feels disenfranchised,
Right.
Where there's maybe an elite group of people, politicians on both parties, making decisions, but I think there's a disconnect as far as the politicians understanding what everyday people are going through at the moment. For instance, how much does $100 get you in groceries these days? Not very much, and I don't think some of the politicians can appreciate that, where folks have been either unemployed or they're underemployed, and they're not bringing home the same amount of income they were previously making, and how do they struggle on an everyday basis?
I think that, here, for those of us who are in colleges and universities in the country, that comes down to the high cost of tuition and the burden of debt. I want to just sort of bring up something that went viral on Facebook last week, and in a twist of fate, or under the heading of "It's a Small World, Isn't It?" It's a student that I knew at Hamline University in St. Paul who took a photograph of himself with the following. I'll read it, put it on his Facebook page, and now it's going all around the world. It says, "I am a college professor increasingly frustrated by the incredible debt I see my students taking on. According to the University of Minnesota, in 1968, a student working 6.2 hours a week at minimum wage would have earned enough to pay annual tuition and fees of $385. That was back when education was considered a public good and not a private investment, back when education was for the 99%. Well, this appeared on the front page of the Star Tribune, Minneapolis Star Tribune, this last weekend, and you can imagine the comments were going just wild back and forth, because one of the points was that back in the day, in 1968, higher education wasn't for the 99%.
Right.
And that's one of the issues. But I would say underneath this is the idea that instead of college being the kind of thing one can finance, either with help from one's parents and a part-time job, it's become something that we finance with student loans.
Which I'm all too familiar with. Surprisingly, I have 3 degrees. The first degree I was able to pay for with some help from my parents at Central Connecticut State University. I came out debt-free with a 4-year degree. I went part-time for an MBA. I was able to finance that as well. For my law degree, I had to borrow approximately $80,000 for a 3-year degree, which I weighed the cost-benefit, thinking at the end of the day I would be able to pay this off, and it would be a reasonable amount of money to borrow. And in the big picture, it has been manageable. But I do know some contemporaries, and I do know some other folks, at least getting out of law school, who have $100,000 in undergraduate debt, and then are taking on an additional 6-figure amount of money to finance law school, and then are graduating and earning $50,000, approximately $50,000, and you do the math, it just doesn't add up. I know at least 2 circumstances where people are full-time lawyers and they actually moonlight and do bartending work,
Right.
just to
right.
supplement their income. And earlier this year, there was an article in the Hartford Courant where there was a recent grad, I believe, from UConn, who passed the bar exam, could not find a job in the legal field. She was living at home and working as a nanny just to make enough money to cover her credit card bills. So if that's the sign of the times.
Yeah, well, pundits are saying that this is going to be the new housing bubble. I mean, I actually don't have the data in front of me, so I can't tell you how many billions of dollars are out in loans to students, but it's billions, right? And just like the inflated value of homes and banks loaning against that inflated value,
Right.
this is a real concern, I think, that and it's all interwoven with the rebounding, or we hope the rebounding of the economy, because of course in a full economy, people are making good money. Those
Right.
loans are obviously very good investments. Just
Right.
like property is always kind of a really good investment. It's always going to appreciate. But then now we're in the doldrums of this recession that just seems to go on and on and on.
Right, and it's become problematic because you have people with more debt who are frustrated they can't get jobs to begin with, and then the jobs they're making aren't enough to cover their debt that they borrowed to go to school. These other issues where even if you could file bankruptcy, student loan debt is not dischargeable at the moment,
Right.
so you're stuck with that even if you were able to file for bankruptcy. You know, it's come to the point, I was telling Anna earlier, some students, I know this at least the law school level, are suing institutions because they're claiming some institutions have misrepresented their job prospects post-graduation while they're taking on significant amount of debt. And when they do get when they do finish school, the jobs aren't there, but the bills are and the loans.
So what would you say to a college student who's saying, I mean, I could stop out and work for a while, try to save some money. I could go to school. I could borrow a student loan. What would your advice be?
That's an interesting question. I think you just have to be prudent. I probably would suggest you try to borrow the least amount of money as possible. If you could get through your 4-year degree and have a minimum amount of debt, that's probably the better way to go. But I think you have to be educated to the fact that the bills or the loans are going to come due. You know, if you're borrowing 3 times what your potential salary is, that's probably problematic, depending on what field you're in. And I think probably schools should be a little more better about this, where they should educate the students as far as the money they're going to borrow and ultimately what the monthly payments are going to be. Again, I do have some colleagues that have student loan payments that are equivalent to a mortgage.
Right, exactly.
And
Yeah.
I just think students need to see the hard figures of what they're actually going to be paying post-graduation and when the loan is put into place and you have to start making payments on the loan.
Right. Well, in a previous program, I interviewed Emily Canto from our career planning office, and I mean, I think that we do the best. We offer quite a very valuable service to students. Of course, they got to take advantage of it. It's an interesting transition from high school to college, or from being out in the workforce, or even out of the workforce and then coming back into college. There's so many things to consider, and the college does offer some help in sorting those issues through. At the same time, it just like the running for president and determining which way the economy ought to go, it's a complex thing, because any number of people, and I would be one of them, who would say students ought to figure out what they love and then figure out how to earn a living doing what they love. And sometimes these are quirky occupations that we wouldn't even know about.
Sure.
Versus going to ones where maybe there's a surefire way to earn some money. But it isn't something that you're passionate about or feel like it's making your life richer as a result. Right. Yeah. So.
Right. And that would be the other comment. Before you decide to go to college, pick something you love. Mm-hmm. You'd hate to go into a field that you don't love and invest $50,000-$60,000 and then all of a sudden you're at a different school. I guess think through it.
Right. Yeah. Well, the good thing, so I will just make a generational comment. When I started college, there was a certain stigma attached to dropping out of school. Mm-hmm. Anymore, students are doing what we call swirling. They go from one school to the other. There's no stigma, and that allows you to, to get started, go down a path, and go, time for a correction of course. Right. Think about it a little bit, go to another school or go into another major in the school you're in. So this is a much better time, I think, to be a college student as a result, despite the fact that we want to be sure that everyone understands the responsibilities they take on when they sign those loan papers. All right, Ben, I so much appreciate your coming back to talk about these big issues with me. And I want to say to the listeners that this has been Middlesex Moments radio show. And I've been visiting here with Ben Boutaugh, professor of business here at Middlesex Community College. If you're interested in learning more about our college, you can visit our website at mxcc.comnet. That's COMMNET.edu. I'm Anna Wasesha, president of Middlesex Community College, wishing you a good day.